Welcome back, everybody, to the Department Number Two podcast, and we're on part three on the Stones River campaign with Dan Masters. My name is Derek Lindo, and I'm here with Daryl Smith. So, how are you guys doing here on this wonderful Saturday afternoon?
It's like Groundhog Day all over again. It's gray, cloudy, and 30 degrees. It's been this way for like the last three Saturdays. So, other than
Well,
that,
down
I'm
here
doing
in
great.
Cincinnati, it's sunny and in the 40s, so we're taking
Oh,
it.
Yeah,
yeah.
it's
I
up in the
mean,
50s
either
for
we're
us
going to have
today.
snow or we're not going to have snow. If we're not going to have it, might as well have nice
I,
days.
I, I'm eagerly looking forward to a month from now being in Tennessee and Georgia for the seminar in the woods and visiting Stones River and whatnot, and hoping that you know maybe it'll be in the 50s or 60s when we get down there. That'll just
Yeah. So,
winter up here can just be kind of a slog. Just got to get through. It's great for writing though, because you can't go outside and do much. So
what else are you going to do? So,
you know, watch
so,
wrestling. Sad to say.
so you mentioned the seminar in the woods,
Mm-hmm.
and let's talk about that just real quick because I think a lot of people might not know what that is down there at Chickamauga. So
Mm-hmm.
have both of you guys been to it? Because I never have been
Oh
able to
yeah,
make it.
yeah.
Well, I would
Um,
probably be the veteran of the group. I think I've been 11 or this might be year number 12 in a row.
I think I've done
So,
three.
yeah.
Yeah, you got me on that one.
Yeah. I got hooked. A couple guys came to a Perryville tour that I was leading. They invited me to come, and I have been going ever since. So, just to give you a little bit of the format, it's David Powell, obviously I'll say notorious author of Chickamauga. He's written, I think he told us
Prolific,
once,
the
yeah,
prolific author of
prolific.
Chickamauga.
He mentioned once, I think he's written 1 million words on the Chickamauga campaign now.
That's
Good.
So
crazy.
put that in perspective, right? And of course, Jim Ogden the third, the national park historian
The
there, uh,
legendary
the
Jim
legendary,
Ogden
the
the third.
Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park historian. I get all that in when you're walking with Jim. And so they graciously, of their time, provide a seminar for us. The Friday is typically a bus tour day, and this is breaking down the campaign into chunks, right? So we've been to Bridgeport, and I mean, you name it, we've probably been around it. Down to Macklemore's Cove, I think I've been to Macklemore's Cove now 3 times myself. So just covering various parts. So every year the topics are a little different. Deeper dives. Usually they're at a brigade and divisional level. And then so Friday, like I said, it's a bus tour, one single bus, charter bus. That does have a cost with it, but it's a very minor cost. And then anything that Dave collects beyond that, he will make a donation, oftentimes to the American Battlefield Trust or the Jewel Fund, which goes towards preservation of the Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park. So that's what Friday is. And then Saturday is on the field. Now, when we had COVID, we did days on the field. Both days are on the field. And so it's a variety of things again every year. So it is just a fantastic time. There's usually 40, 50, 60 of us, depending on how the weather's doing. And it is just, as Dave Powell says, it's an excuse for him to follow Jim Ogden around in the woods. So yeah, it's a great
And
time.
they will hold the event, rain or shine. That one year we had like a ice or snow.
We
Uh,
had,
Friday was good, but then say
yeah,
that's rain, and I mean
yeah.
I already had a cold, so I'm like I
Yeah,
ended
we
up
had
missing
in
out.
the
I think on the
teens with heavy
cheerleading
snow
division,
squalls.
but yeah, it was
Yeah,
that.
great time though.
Yeah,
Great time.
it is
I
a lot
tripped
of
that
fun.
day out to about 4 o'clock, and I said the heater in my car sounds really good right now. So
Yeah, so if you are somebody that's interested in that, I have not been able to go because that is always usually on the same weekend or the weekend before or after this big field trip I take a bunch of kids on. And so it's always difficult to do anything around that time of year in March. But
I
if you,
believe the bus tour is full,
yeah,
it
but
is.
Saturday is wide open.
yeah, you just show up,
The
right?
more the merrier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. You show up for that one. Saturday's a free day, so you can show up for that.
Is
But
that
yes, the
eight
bus
eight
tour is
thirty?
definitely
Usually
filled up.
8:30 at the visitor
hmm
center at Chickamauga. We kind of start from there, and then
hmm Yeah. For example, this year we're talking about Richard Johnson's division on September 19th in Brock Field. This is for the Saturday portion. That's the morning. And then after lunchtime, we are hitting the Confederate assaults in Poe Field on September 20th. So Wood, Bate, Clayton, and McNair. So it's always different, almost every single year.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic. If you ever want to find out more about it, you go to Dave's blog, chickamaugablog.wordpress.com. And usually he posts the information several months in advance, tells you how to send a check if you're interested in the bus tour, and any other details that you need. So good stuff.
Yeah, so we'll make sure to put that on the Facebook site. So anybody that's interested, they can look that up and contact Dave if they need to. So, but we're talking about Stones River today, so I guess we'll swing back over that way. We'll go back in time a few months. So Dan, last time we've spoken, the last two times we covered a lot of material, and at the same time felt like we only scratched the surface there. One thing that I think some people might be interested in is the cavalry actions. What was the Union cavalry doing during this, and what was the Confederate cavalry doing? And we mentioned slightly a little bit about what Forrest and Morgan were off doing. But for the cavalry that remained with the Army of Tennessee, what were they up to? And then on the Union side, what were they doing during all this?
Yeah. One key takeaway for both sides was they didn't have enough cavalry to do what they really wanted them to do. I mean,
Yeah.
kind of get back, what is the primary mission of cavalry in any army? They're supposed to screen the army on an advance, cover retreats, obtain intelligence about enemy dispositions, enemy forces, so on and so forth, protect supply lines. Depending on how few cavalry you have, they may be on courier duty, posts of observation. So there's a lot of different things the cavalry is tasked with. And the cavalry forces of both armies at Stones River were quite busy. So starting off, the Army of the Cumberland had what amounted to 2 full brigades of cavalry and a few regiments of what they called the reserve cavalry. And the reserve cavalry really consisted of a couple of Tennessee, just raised Tennessee cavalry regiments, literally that had been raised and mounted in December of '62, and the infamous, or rather notorious, Anderson Troop, also known as the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry, that had enlisted with the understanding that they would be headquarters guards and couriers, and come to find out, well, not quite. You guys are going to perform as regular cavalry. Enough of these men were upset about it that basically, as the campaign starts on December 26th, they mutiny. Wow. And so what ends up leaving Nashville, of course, it takes several hours to get this straightened out, and they eventually managed to persuade about 200 or 300 of these mutinying troops to go out. But in the meantime, they were supposed to be screening part of the federal advance, so they don't. So that part of McCook's right wing essentially marches out without a cavalry screen. I think it was Jefferson Davis's division. Davis is pretty plucky. Davis just pulls his own escort staff and says, he just pulls his own escort, says, your guys are going to be my cavalry. And he sends them out and he keeps going.
Yeah.
But so the days leading up to the main engagement on the 31st, the federal cavalry is primarily engaged in screening the advance of the army. Robert Minty's brigade on the Nashville Pike is in front of and supporting Crittenden's wing. Lewis Zahm's brigade, which is 3 Ohio regiments, the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Ohio Cavs, is actually on the Army's far, far right. They actually go to basically to Franklin to screen that side of the Army. And then the reserve cavalry is, mumbling and bumbling, stumbling their way into action. They really, like I said, they lose several hours in Nashville straightening out this mutiny mess. And so they, on December 26th, they really don't play too much of a role. On the Confederate side, they have a larger cavalry force. They have, it really breaks down to two large brigades, one under Wheeler, and the other one's under John Wharton. Wheeler's cavalry is basically screening the main army at Murfreesboro. So they are the ones that are actually combating with Crittenden's advance. Was Wharton's brigade, which was based more in the Triune and Nolensville area, is really more fending off. It was trying to slow McCook's advance. There are 2 other brigades attached to the Army of Tennessee. There's one under John Pegram, which I think has 2 regiments, and it's quite small. And the other one is one that'll make Daryl smile. It is the 3 Kentucky regiments that were under Abraham Buford, who were raised as part of the Kentucky campaign. Really, about the only true fruits of the campaign from a troop accession standpoint were these couple of regiments of cavalry and maybe a few hundred other infantrymen. By and large, there was this thought when the Army of Tennessee went into Kentucky in the summer and fall of 1862 that, thousands, what was the number, Daryl, 25,000 or 30,000 Kentuckians would join their ranks. And Bragg's thought was, they're going to join the infantry. They weren't terribly interested in joining the infantry. Most of the recruits they obtained ended up going off into this 3rd, 5th, and 6th Kentucky cavalry regiments. Who were present at Stone. The Pegrams and Buford's brigades are basically kept pretty close to Murfreesboro. So the primary cavalry actions in the opening days of the campaign are between Wheeler, Wharton versus Zahm and Minty for the most part. But that said, I'm going to give both Wheeler and Wharton a lot of props. They did a superb job of slowing the Federal advance. I mean, there's really only 30 miles between Nashville and Stones River in Murfreesboro, for example. Mm-hmm. And it took, the Federal Army left on Friday the 26th. They really didn't arrive on the battlefield. Crittenden's men got in on the 29th, which was Monday. And McCook really started coming in on Tuesday the 30th. So the delaying actions that Wheeler's men fought primarily at Laverne certainly slowed the Federal advance. So they did a good job there. The Federal cavalry was really it was very much in transition. David Stanley was one of the first men that Rosecrans, told the War Department, I need a good cavalry chief. I need David Stanley. And he had served with Stanley at Corinth. I think at Corinth, Stanley was a divisional commander, if memory serves, but of infantry. A regular, another fellow Catholic. Rosecrans did have an affinity for his Catholics, and but he proved to be an inspired choice, I think. But he comes on board, and really the way that the cavalry had been employed in the previous Army of Ohio. It had been broken up into just dozens of these little detachments, a company here, a company there, right. Maybe a battalion there. And for cavalry to really be effective, it needs to be massed. And it hadn't been. And that was like Stanley's first fight was with the generalship in the Army was, convincing these brigade and divisional commanders, hey, you need to give up your cavalry detachments so I can get a force together that we can actually do something with them. And Rosecrans was on board with that, so he eventually got the men. But I mean, the cavalry forces, becoming concentrated. One of the other things that Stanley noted was that there was not much emphasis on saber drill, or really none at all. There was too much reliance upon their carbines and pistols. So he set the blacksmiths to work getting the sabers all sharpened up, and really with the emphasis on the saber drill. Kind of conversely, the Confederate cavalry, they're called cavalry, but by and large, you'd probably be more properly termed as mounted infantry. That's essentially how they fought.
Yeah.
And a lot of the ways, the way they were armed. A lot of these troops, I mean, they would have their share of pistols and whatnot, but by and large, they didn't have carbines. Most of them had Enfield or long rifles of some sort, which are extremely unhandy atop a horse.
Right.
The Confederate cavalry tended to fight more as mounted infantry at this point in the war, which kind of drives some of some of the action when you look at what happens at Nolensville and Knob Gap and then Trioune. I mean, they're essentially fighting as infantry. So that's really what the cavalry is doing for the days leading up to the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
On December 30th, Wheeler begins his ride around the Federal Army. By that point, both armies are basically they're starting to butt heads pretty hard at Murfreesboro. Bragg dispatches Wheeler to basically get into the Federal rear and cause as much mayhem as he can. He crosses Stones River really beyond Rosecrans' left, rides up to a place called Jefferson Pike and gets into quite a little squabble with John C. Starkweather's brigade, destroys some wagons there, then moves to Laverne and does a lot more damage, including taking McCook's headquarters wagon. And one of the prizes they take back to Murfreesboro is General McCook's rather large coat, because he's rather a large individual, and that was considered quite a prize, as well as personal letters that McCook's father had sent him. That the I think the Mobile Daily News or the Mobile Tribune eventually published, these salacious details out of these private letters. So a bit of an embarrassment, but they do tend to cause a fair amount of mayhem in the Federal rear. He basically does an entire circuit around Rosecrans' army. Most of the prisoners that are taken are paroled right on the spot. I mean, they essentially,
right.
Until you're properly exchanged, you can't fight. So some of these guys, they rip those paroles up and just go join the army anyway. Others like, well, this is my excuse to get out of the fighting, and they go back to Nashville. So Wheeler's raid is disruptive, but the wagons he ends up destroying, I said, a lot of them are like headquarters wagons. So, like, for example, like the 21st Ohio Infantry, the regimental books were burned during Wheeler's raid. So part of the records for the regiment before Stones River are spotty because so many of them were just lost. But that's just one example. But like the ammunition wagons, he didn't get to any of those. What he did get was some provision wagons and things like that. So the raid, while kind of spectacular and certainly got a lot of press, certainly with the Confederate press, at the end of the day, didn't really degrade the Army of the Cumberland's ability to fight this battle. Like I said, it was more of a significant distraction, but it was just a distraction.
Right.
On December 31st, Wharton's brigade, we were still talking about the Confederates, plays a very important role. They are the far left of the Confederate advance when they hit Johnson's division, and they scoop up prisoners by the hundreds and by the thousands, and really do quite a spectacular job. The only real cavalry on cavalry fight of any size happens on the 31st, and it's between Zahm's Ohioans and Wharton's brigade. If the listeners are familiar with the north side of the national park at Stones River, there's two roads. There's one called Asbury Road and Asbury Lane that meet at an intersection at, oddly enough, Asbury Church. And Zahm's brigade was tasked with escorting McCook's ammunition train, which was retreating up Asbury Lane, going north toward what now is the Horde House. And Wharton tried to take the train and actually partially took it. The 1st Ohio Cavalry staged a very daring, hell-bent for leather cavalry saber charge right into the middle of Wharton's brigade. They managed to break Wharton's hold on the train for a little bit. Minor Milliken, who was the colonel of the 1st Ohio, is killed in basically close quarters combat. My great grandfather was among them. He was in Company H of the 1st Ohio Cav, so this was probably his highest or lowest point of the war, depending on your perspective. Certainly the most intense.
Yeah.
But they managed to break Wharton's hold for a very brief amount of time. But then Wharton ends up overwhelming the First Ohio Cav. They retreat off the field, and essentially the 4th U.S. Cavalry comes in and saves the day. As Wharton's men are starting to pick over this ammunition train, the 4th U.S. Cav charges, drives them off, and actually the train is saved. So, like I said, that was pretty intense action.
Yeah.
On the 31st. The last cavalry action on the 31st was actually these two. Wheeler's brigade shows up in Murfreesboro, and he sent once again on the Confederate far left, which is now near the Nashville Pike, and was directed with Buford's brigade to seize the crossing at Overall Creek and basically break up whatever federal traffic was going on up there. Wheeler and Buford just don't have the power to do that. They give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
Buford, he might suffer a dozen casualties. I mean, they don't get anywhere near the pike.
Right.
Wheeler gets into a pretty hefty scrap with Minty's cavalry, but he doesn't, he can't get to it either. For the rest of the battle, Wheeler is sent again on a raid on January 1st. He gets to Laverne and gets into a really nasty squabble with the 1st Michigan Engineers and Mechanics, and is defeated and comes back to the army. You got to think by this point, these guys have been in the saddle every day for a week. They've had minimal chance to rest, minimal chance. The horses are starting to break down. They've been rode pretty hard for a week. And by the time Wheeler's cavalry gets back to Murfreesboro on January 2nd, they're essentially a spent force.
Yeah.
They need refit and recuperation. They were just not really. The real failing here was, as they're making this raid on January 1st, they're also supposed to figure out what's the Federal Army doing. Are they retreating or not? And he brings Bragg back the mistaken impression that the Federal Army is preparing to retreat. They just need to be pushed,
Mm-hmm.
and that they will retreat. What he didn't understand, the wagons he saw going back to Nashville was loaded with men that were wounded or sick. And the task was they were going to go back to Nashville, reload with ammunition and provisions, and come back with more reinforcements to continue the battle. It was not he misread the situation,
Mm-hmm.
but Bragg's later actions on January 2nd, you got to understand that's what basically his intelligence arm is telling him,
Mm-hmm.
is that the Federal Army is looking to leave, and that was not the case. And Wheeler is responsible for that. And Dave Powell did an incredible book called Failure in the Saddle,
Yes.
which discusses the Confederate cavalry's struggles, shall we say, in the Chickamauga campaign. And so many of the themes that he touches on there are like, they just come out to play here at Stones River once again, like at Chickamauga. The cavalry is feeding the Army commander core intelligence at the end of the day, things that were just flat out wrong or misinterpreted. And, Bragg makes his decisions based on that intelligence. And when it goes bad, it's Bragg's fault. Well, it's kind of some responsibility for the cavalry there too. I mean, ultimately, you got to understand too, Wheeler's Bragg's guy.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And Wheeler's, shall we say, his performance at Stones River is very mixed. I think his performance up to the beginning of the battle was really, really good. The 30th and beyond, it's a little more mixed. And then, he has some pretty significant intelligent misses here that have an impact on how the rest of the battle's fought. So, as I said, the cavalry for both armies was very, very busy during this battle. There just wasn't enough of them to go around.
So for Wheeler, and I can't remember if it's Stones River or not, but was he commanding a brigade while also commanding the entire?
Yeah, very mixed up command situation. He was the chief of cavalry and was commanding a brigade. He did not delegate command of that brigade to anyone else. He did that in person.
So in your view, did that cloud his ability to actually perform well?
It yes, it did. It really kind of localized his attention. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, he's a brigade commander. He's really majorly concerned about what's in front of him. Uh, Wheeler was, I mean, he was a West Pointer. He was a skilled officer, probably a little over his depth here,
Mm-hmm.
and stretched too thin. I mean, really, he needed to delegate someone else to take command of the brigade so he could really serve as a chief of cavalry, with responsibility for the whole Confederate front, not just the narrow front
Mm-hmm.
along the Nashville Pike. Um, and that's a consistent problem that you see, later on in the Chickamauga campaign, where Nathan Bedford Forrest has essentially command of a cavalry corps, and he's out in front, essentially sometimes acting as almost like a company commander, all the way out in front, making personal reconnaissance and
Right.
whatnot. And I don't know there was a lot of challenges that they had with the Confederate cavalry that really started coming home to roost in 1863.
Yeah.
Their glory days were starting. Hartsville in December of '62 was their high point.
Yeah, I agree.
And things started to degrade after that. I mean, and honestly, the Union cavalry only got better.
Yeah.
As the war progressed.
All right, so that's that really opens up things, I think, on cavalry, because, like you said, when you study Stones River, the cavalry you don't think of the cavalry very much because they're way off a lot of the times doing other
Yeah,
things.
well, they're on the periphery. Let's be honest. Civil War buffs tend to be attracted to really bloody engagements.
Yeah, yeah.
The heavier the fighting, the more people tend to be drawn to it. And a lot of the cavalry actions don't, they're not written in buckets of blood. They're important in what they ended up guiding how the main fighting turns out. Like I said, Wharton's brigade had a very important role with the success of that Confederate assault on the right wing. Dennis Belcher did a book. It's a McFarland book, so it's a little pricey, but about the cavalry at Stones River, which I highly recommend. It's a superbly researched book, a good flowing narrative. But yeah, it touches on a lot of these aspects of the battle that by and large we don't hear much about.
Yeah.
But yeah, very very a superb study.
Yeah, I second that. So one thing that we've briefly touched on, kind of mentioned it here and there in the last few episodes, was Carter Stevenson's division that is not at Stones River or Murfreesboro. So we're going to wade a little bit into the what if waters here, and which a lot of people might not like what ifs, but at the same time it's fun to think about, well, what might have happened if one particular thing had not happened. And in this case, what would the Battle of Stones River have been like had Carter Stevenson's division not been sent west down to Vicksburg?
Yeah. So just kind of get the listeners, in the pew with us. Carter Stevenson's division actually belonged to Kirby Smith's Department of East Tennessee. It was not an integral part of the Army of Tennessee proper, as was General John C. McCown's division, which was present at Stones River. McCown's division also belonged to Kirby Smith's department. In mid-December 1862, Jefferson Davis visits the Army at Murfreesboro to kind of gauge its readiness for action, and also to kind of see for himself what condition the Army is in. He comes away with the impression that the Army of Tennessee is in a very good state of discipline, well armed, well equipped, well dressed, and comes away very impressed with the condition of the Army. The thing that Davis is concerned about is he knows that there are efforts on the federal side to launch a campaign into Mississippi and against Vicksburg, and that those efforts are going to happen sooner than later. And he's very concerned about the weakness of the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg. Mm-hmm. Is concerned that if we lose Vicksburg, I mean the Federals have already advanced north from New Orleans, I mean, there was a battle fought in Baton Rouge in August of '62. The Federal Army and Navy have already advanced south on the Mississippi River as far as Memphis. So you kind of have this narrow section of the Mississippi River that is still Confederate controlled. And Vicksburg, of course, is the linchpin of that position. And there's some localism coming in here too. Jefferson Davis was a Mississippian.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure when the folks in the governor of Mississippi and the political leadership of Mississippi are sharing their concerns with Davis, he's a very willing audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think his own brother had a plantation very near Vicksburg. So I mean, lots of things influencing Davis here. But the key one is he does not want the Confederacy cut in two. And if the Union Army and Navy can take Vicksburg, they're very close to accomplishing that goal. So that's his overarching concern in mid-December of 1862, which prompts him to, give Bragg his orders, fight them here if you must and retreat to the Tennessee if you have to.
Yeah.
And basically gives him a permission to do so. But he's like, I have to take this division. I have to send. Why Stevenson's division was chosen instead of McCown's, I've never seen any reason for that. But I've seen various reports as to how many men that amounted to, anywhere from 7,000 to 9,000. But that said, Bragg's whole army that fights at Murfreesboro is about 37,000. And of that 37, I'd offer about 4,000 to 5,000 of them were cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
So 7,000 or 9,000 infantrymen is a quarter of his force.
Yeah, that would
quarter of his infantry force. But they depart. I think right around December 20th, they start. They have to take a very roundabout route to get to Vicksburg because of the condition of the Southern Railroad network at that time. But they leave the army before Rosecrans leaves Nashville. Rosecrans does not find out that Stevenson's division has left until December 29th. So he launched his offensive against Murfreesboro not knowing that Stevenson wasn't there. He knew that Forrest wasn't there and that Morgan was off raiding in Kentucky, and that's what triggered him to move.
Mm-hmm.
He had no knowledge that Stevenson had left. So the real speculation comes in is like, okay, well, what if Stevenson's division hadn't left?
Yes.
Because their timing of leaving, we also have the Grant's offensive into Mississippi is going on at about this same time. I mean, there's the Confederate cavalry action at Holly Springs that basically cuts the underpinnings out of the overland offensive. But then there's the fighting at Chickasaw Bayou on the 26th, 27th, 29th, and 30th that is a Union repulse. Stevenson's men don't get there until that action is completed.
Yeah. So
it was a Confederate victory. So they're in transit at, I guess, exactly the wrong time. I mean, they don't arrive at Vicksburg in time to influence that campaign. And their absence from Stones River certainly impacted that campaign. Mm-hmm. So the timing just didn't work. So the question is, if Bragg had these, we'll say if he had these 8,000 more infantrymen at Stones River, would it have made a difference? I would offer it would have made a decisive difference, mm-hmm. properly employed.
Right.
And that's the key.
Yeah. Because, I mean, if he had just been sending them brigade after brigade at the Round Forest, it's not going to...
If we repeated that, all we're going to have is a thicker carpet of gray-clad bodies in front of that force. That's all you're going to get.
Yeah.
There were so many Federal troops packed into that salient. I don't know what, short of a mass panic, I don't know what Bragg could have done to break that position on the 31st. Mm-hmm. But there was opportunity elsewhere on the field, further north on the Nashville Pike. As I said, it all comes down to had they been properly deployed and put in the right place. When you think about the Confederate line on the beginning of December 31st, the far left brigades and the far left division is John C. McCown's division. organizationally speaking, Carter Stevenson's division, given that they're both part of the Department of Eastern Tennessee, would have probably been about in the same position or further to the left. They
Mm-hmm.
might have been the left flank division themselves. If that's the case, and they remained in that position through all the subsequent fighting, through the morning and early afternoon, you would have had a situation, you could have potentially had a situation that would have developed along Asbury Lane and Asbury Road. Claiborne's division drives over. Rosecrans had 3 brigades that fought them up in that sector of the field. Claiborne's division drives them off and then is pushing them towards the Nashville Pike. There were no troops to Claiborne's left. He was essentially the left of the line, but there was ample maneuvering room there for another division.
Mm-hmm.
If that division was Stevenson and Stevenson was relatively intact, he could have cut the Nashville Pike at about Overalls Creek, where essentially we discussed a little while ago Wheeler and Buford trying to break the federal lines up there. You couldn't do it with cavalry, but essentially what was guarding that sector of the field was a combination of stragglers that the 9th Michigan infantry had gathered up through the course of the day, and portions of Robert Minty's cavalry brigade. Now, I know there's criticism out there that while you look at the combat record for Stevenson's division, it's not very good. I mean, they're generally not very successful. I kind of struggle to think that if Stevenson's division was relatively intact and in that position, I don't think 500 or 600 federal cavalrymen are going to keep them off the Nashville Pike. They could have broken the federal hold on the pike. They essentially would have broken the supply route and the retreat route.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if they were employed the way that, say, Breckinridge's division was employed, just sending these brigade after brigade attacks against the Round Forest, it wouldn't have made a difference.
Yeah.
But that also doesn't take into account that Breckinridge's division was on the Confederate far right, basically on Wayne's Hill,
Mm-hmm.
and very close to the Round Forest. So they were put into action because they were in close proximity
Mm-hmm.
into the salient that Bragg felt he had to take. I think the real opportunity, and he may not have understood it at the time, being Bragg,
Yeah.
the real opportunity existed on the Confederate far left beyond Claiborne's left. Had Stevenson's division been employed there, I wonder that the Battle of Stones River would have turned out very differently. But I mean, the short answer, this is all speculative because he wasn't there.
Yeah.
And things developed the way they did. But I think it would have it could have made a large difference if it was in the right part of the field where they were employed.
Yeah. That's always interesting to think about, these what ifs. It's, you can't study it, but you can think about it and wonder, and especially something like that where that whole division was left too early to influence Stones River and was too late to influence anything going on at Chickasaw Bayou.
Yeah, they were essentially out of the war for 2 or 3 weeks. It was on the one hand, it worked out in Vicksburg, didn't work out so well in Stones River.
Right.
That's the breaks sometimes.
Yeah, you touched on something there, Dan, too. The thought process of Stevenson's division not necessarily being the most proficient. Hence the reason they were kind of they were the largest division, but also a division that wasn't expected to get into any combat around Cumberland Gap during the Kentucky campaign. And again, a wasted use of that particular division, as they will move into Kentucky, but really don't influence anything, much like Kirby Smith's
and
rest
a
of his
large
command.
division.
Yeah, huge division. It was 8,000, I think, during the Kentucky campaign, somewhere in that ballpark. So, could have been Bragg's mindset too. It's like, well, let's take the division that maybe isn't as most proficient and send them.
Honestly, I think he would have sent McCown's division if he would have had his
he wasn't a fan of McCown, was he?
He had a pretty dim view of John's, and McCown, he reciprocated. I mean, McCown's resignation a few months later, a damning Bragg and the whole Cotton oligarchy. Not a lot of love lost there between those two, but like I said, they were the timing of their departure was it ended up striking the wrong note on a lot of counts, but the president directed it.
Yeah.
Following Joe Johnston, who had that's the other. We haven't talked much about Joe Johnston in the context of Stones River, but he was the overall department commander for this section of the Confederacy at this point. He objected to the Stevenson transfer as vigorously as he could. Now, understand he has a very a difficult relationship with Jefferson Davis already, which only gets worse with time. But Johnston pointed out repeatedly that the real you ought to be reinforcing Vicksburg with Theophilus Holmes men that are stationed in Arkansas. Just transfer them across the river. It's a lot closer logistically. They'll be able to get there in time to make a difference. And Davis, just wasn't interested in doing that. Depending on which accounts you read, his previous Secretary of War, and I'm drawing a blank, I want to say James Seddon, had basically recommended that same operation back in November. Davis had sent an order out essentially directing Holmes to do this, and then Seddon sent an additional communication to kind of clarify what Davis had said. And Davis was so incensed by this, I mean, he really takes Seddon to task. Seddon resigns. And so now, in part, it's like, even though the moving Holmes men is probably the right move to do, now there's like a pride element, like, he isn't going to do it because then he'd be admitting Seddon was right, and that would fuel his critics. I mean,
can't have that.
I was just like, oh my goodness. So instead, we're going to move a division, probably a 700-mile rail, and it's not like a direct line. I mean, you got to go south to Atlanta and then down all the way to Mobile and then up. I mean, it's quite an ordeal and quite a stress on the Confederate logistics system at this time. But
wow,
that's how nations rise and fall on these. The sum result of these kind of decisions.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Just the stress to move that many thousands of men on the rail lines. I mean,
which were not in good condition.
No, and it's not like they could. Well, let's send them on a different one because we got some more stuff coming this way. You can't do that.
What other one?
Exactly with what they have. So
what other one?
Yeah, so
either that or we march them overland, and that how long is that going to take? 2 months,
right? And so Confederate logistics, I think that deserves several episodes all on its own. Just the mess
it's amazing to me that the Confederacy accomplished as much as it did.
Oh, me too.
With the logistical underpinnings that it had. I mean, it was just that it was really an agrarian economy that did not have the industry necessary to really gear up for war. I mean, that they lasted as long as they did is really a testament to me to the courage and the tenacity of the individual Confederate soldier.
So Dan, after writing this book, it's a lot of work goes into these, obviously, especially the size of your Stones River book coming out. So there's a lot of people out there that we think would benefit from hearing how your process was during this whole thing. What for you, what was the best way to research, or, how did you go about coming up with this, and did you organize things? So I'm just throwing out a bunch of stuff right now, but
sure.
Just, for the average person who never has written a book and would think maybe that's something I want to do one day, tell us about how you did this.
Yeah. For starters, don't write a campaign history as your first book. Quite an undertaking. I had been, just to give some background, I had been just gathering material about Stones River. I bet I started in 2000 or 2001. I didn't actually put pen to paper until I think November 11th, 2021. It was so, I mean, it was 20 years of gathering. Now, granted, I had intentions all the way back in like 2002 or 2003 of writing a Stones River campaign history, life got in the way. I did, so it wasn't like I was constantly gathering, but there was, every year I was adding something, to these files. And so much of it was just like, if it's Stones River related, I want it.
Right.
I didn't, a lot of it was, I didn't even read like really in depth of what was there. It's just, okay, well, here's a new account from a guy in the First Georgia Cavalry. I know they were there. I'm going to pull it and stick it in the file.
Mm-hmm.
So 4 bankers boxes later of accounts, and I still use them frequently. The key was to get the information organized. So I right off the get go, anything that I found, I had individual file folders for each brigade. The files that are in there are organized by regiment in alphabetical order. I mean, it's very organized in how you put all this together, because you're going to need to find this stuff
Mm-hmm.
later. Organization is the key. Having the space to put this stuff. Now, I know a lot of people are like, oh, that's old school. You're using paper and whatnot. I tell you what, the wonderful thing about paper is the hard drive doesn't die on it.
Yeah.
And you don't get hacked or anything else. Once you have the paper, you have it. It's also, kind of a burden to move around, but I tend to like to print things because they don't get lost.
Yeah.
I had something happen on my computer last year where I had several hundred photographs that just disappeared, and it took me a month to figure out what happened. I mean, thankfully, I had them backed up on another hard drive, but what if that had been my book files? I mean, I'd be a lot of egg on my face going to Ted, hey, I need another year on this book. I lost my manuscript.
I can't imagine.
Organization is the key. And the other thing, if you're going to write about anything, you need to be passionate about it. It needs to light you up for whatever reason. If it is hard for you as an author to not let your emotions come through your work. And
right.
if you're really enjoying what you're doing, your readers will pick up on it. If what you're doing is a task, they're going to pick up on that too. And I mean, usually the books that excite us as readers, the author pulls you into the story, and you end up, you become invested. You want to learn, it's like, it just, they find a way to, to sink the hook. It's almost like, rock music. A song with a good hook just pulls you in.
Yeah.
Same way with a book. So you need to be, if you're going to write, you need to be passionate about, what you want to write about, whether it's, the Civil War or anything, really.
So,
but get organized, and also realize that we're living in a golden age, I guess, of Civil War research, because so much of what was hard 20 years ago is now a piece of cake.
There's so much online.
No, yes. I just think of resources. We have like Spared and Shared.
Yeah.
Will Griffin, I don't know, 20,000 some Civil War letters.
Yeah.
That's a good place to start.
It is.
So many of our newspapers are now online.
Yeah.
Newspapers.com or Chronicling America. When I first started back in 2001, when I wanted to get copies of the Mobile newspapers, we just so happened to vacation in Gulf Shores one year. So I somehow persuaded my wife to let me go to the library in Mobile.
Well, that's what you got to do on vacation,
I got to get this stuff. I mean, that's just what you had to do.
Yeah.
Writing letters. I mean, it was just. And also, the university archives and state archives have done a really nice job of putting so much of their content online in PDF forms and whatnot. So it's what you run into, in back in the old days when I started, was the challenge was not being able to get enough material because you didn't know where it was.
Yeah.
I think we almost run into the opposite problem today, is that there is so much. You don't know how to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because there's a letter from some guy in the 26th Alabama doesn't mean it's going to help you with your project.
Right.
And you can get overwhelmed with, instead of 4 bankers boxes, you might have eight bankers boxes. And then your job as a historian gets a little harder because you don't have a surfeit of material, you have a surplus.
Right.
And how do you decide which of that is really significant? And really, the way you start figuring out what's significant, you start talking to other people in the field, and they help you, kind of hone your antenna. Do a lot of reading. Yeah. If you want to write a campaign study of the Civil War, pick up some of the really good ones, and see how it's done.
Yeah.
Anything by Dave Powell, anything by Peter Cousins, in my opinion. John Hennessy's study of the Second Manassas Campaign,
Fantastic.
a gem. Pick up books like that and read it, and as you're reading it, think about, okay, well, how's he putting this together? Which means you're probably going to spend some time looking at their footnotes, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it is.
But if that's the kind of work you want to do, study some of the stuff that's already been published, that has received good critical reviews, and see what you can learn from it. If you get a chance, and most of these guys are tickled pink if you reach out to them through Facebook or something you want to talk to them about. They're generally very, very helpful.
Yeah, they wrote a book about it. Typically, they're passionate about it. They love talking about it.
So they usually want to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, most of the authors, at least in the Civil War space, there is a community aspect to it. They're all about furthering the study of this conflict. And if there's something you really want to, hey, I've been thinking about doing a book about, I don't know, the first week of the Atlanta campaign or whatnot, and you'll get encouragement. But that networking can be extraordinarily beneficial. The historians at the National Park Service. I could not have written my Stones River book without the help of Jim Lewis at Stones River. Huge help. Gave me ready access to the park's regimental files, which are very extensive. I almost wonder, I went down to Murfreesboro 3 times in 2004 and 2005 to copy out basically everything that they had. It took 3 trips to do it. And then, it wasn't until 16 years later that I actually started writing the book. I got to think at some point, Jim Lewis was like, I extended you this hospitality for 3 weeks and you ain't written a thing yet. What's going on with you? And, but yeah, cultivate those sources. These guys, there's folks that know a lot about this conflict that are willing to share that information. You just kind of need to find who they are, and
for sure.
Generally speaking, they'll help you out.
Yeah. So I just my first book's coming out soon too. I'm not going to talk about that right now because I want to talk about yours. But I will say that I learned a lot about the process of writing, how to put something like this together, and looking back, if I were to do this again, there's a lot of things I would do differently the second time around. So for you, what's something that you learned that you might tell somebody, don't do what I did? I know from experience that this just made my job harder. I'm going to do it this way this time.
So, and I have to be careful here because I have self-published 8 books of my own. So I kind of have my own, Columbia and Arsenal Press standards that we use. And then, Savas Beatty has their own style guide, and mine and theirs don't necessarily coincide. If you are writing for a publisher, if you have a contract with, it's Savas Beatty or University of Kansas, whatever, really read the style guide up front and then write accordingly. Because otherwise, you'll have to do like what I did and go back and revise your manuscript 2 or 3 times. Now, you're going to have to, that's the other thing, understand that even amongst the best writers, rewrites are a way of life. It's not a reflection that you're a bad author or anything. It's just, consider it, when we get a gem out of the ground, it is not ready to be put in a mount and put on your lady love's finger right off the bat. It takes a lot of work to refine that down to it, to bring out its beauty. And that's all the rewriting process is just refining that stone down to take off the the burrs and the bad edges and whatnot, to make it better. Now, the other thing is there is something to be said that sometimes you just get a flash of brilliance and you write something and it's just, you're blown away by it. Sometimes you hold on to those real tight because you don't want to lose that. Rewrites are a part of life. So just expect that when your manuscript's done, it's not done until your publisher says it's done. But read that. Read the style guide very carefully and adhere to it. You'll save yourself work in the end. And by all means, use active voice as often as possible, or Uncle Teddy will, wrap your knuckles.
Yep.
So, but and that's good advice. I think whether you're writing for Savas Beatty or anybody else,
Yeah, and
that makes your writing a little more tight, a little less wordy. But yeah, and the other thing is, uh, don't be afraid to write something and then dispense with it later.
mm-hmm.
I remember there were several kind of lengthy paragraphs I had in my book that at the time that I wrote them, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like literally brilliant. And then I read it later, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is awful. And you just end up chucking it.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the other, I guess for me, I can be kind of, call it streaky when it comes to my writing. Like there's some days where I would come down to this basement at 4 a.m. and I'd crank out like 1,500 words in an hour, and it just flowed like butter.
Yeah.
And there's other days I would come down here and I'd know within 10 minutes, like, I'm not getting anything written today.
Yeah.
Don't waste that. Don't just get discouraged and walk away. Use that time to go back and edit what you've already written.
Mm-hmm.
And really, it'll get you back into the cadence. And then you end up getting, always make sure, maximize. I'm going to use a Jim Ross term from wrestling. Maximize your minutes. When you're in the ring, make sure you're making a difference.
Yeah.
Even if it is just editing. Yeah, I wrote this 3 days ago. I'm going to edit and type. Your book's going to be better for it.
And you will always find something to edit. I mean,
yeah.
Going back in mine, I kept thinking, what's done? It's not done.
Yeah, don't get discouraged because you come down and for whatever reason the writing juices aren't flowing. I mean, we're human beings. We're erratic. Things are going on in life. I mean, maybe the weather's bad, or your problems with your spouse or your kids or work, or it's okay.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing, I think I seem like I say this once a week. Our job as historians is to not arrive at the final answer because there is none.
Mm-hmm.
Our job is to take the football and try to move it down the field. And there's times where you can move it a long way. If you're really exploring an aspect of something that hasn't been studied before, you might move the ball 70 yards.
Mm-hmm.
Other times you just might move it a few yards. It doesn't mean your work's not important and non-valid. I mean, think about like Gettysburg. There has been so much written about Gettysburg.
Yeah.
That's a really challenge. I mean, I don't know anyone that's going to move the ball 70 yards down the field on Gettysburg because it has been studied extensively. But there's a lot of folks that can move it down the field, a couple of yards,
mm-hmm.
and they sell tons of books every year about it. So. Sure. I will confess that when I started writing the book, being the descendant of 5 Union veterans of the Civil War, 2 of whom were at Stones River. I had an uncle that was essentially mortally wounded in action there. Certainly more of a Army of the Cumberland partisan when I started. Naturally, which we would expect. I mean, it's family, and it really kind of drove me to get into this. My respect for the Confederate soldier increased exponentially in this study. The things that really strike me about them, such incredible daring and courage. Despite how bad things might have gone, they were there on the field doing their duty. When I think of Adams' attack on the Round Forest, which I think was probably the closest of any of them that came to cracking the Union hold on that very important piece of ground. They were the third attack to go against this position. The ground in front of them was carpeted, and I mean carpeted, with hundreds of their dead and wounded comrades. And despite that, seeing that in front of them, they charged as if victory was just a stone's throw away. I disagree heartily, completely with the Confederate cause. But I don't know how you can't admire that courage, that ability to just put all that aside and just put it all on the line to accomplish your goal. And I, as I said, repeatedly came away in awe of how courageous these and how brave and courageous these men were. I mean, I cannot imagine trying to charge across, or thinking of Patton Anderson's brigade of Mississippians trying to charge against Miller and Stanley down, now what is now the south end of the National Battlefield Park, into the teeth of multiple Confederate artillery that are just throwing round after round, double-shotted canister right into their ranks. Despite these losses, they closed up ranks and kept pushing.
Mm-hmm.
That's courage.
Yeah.
That is, it's mind-blowing. And it's not to take anything away from the Army of the Cumberland. We have repeated examples of that same courage on the other side. But for me, when I wrote the book, I made a very deliberate effort to be as even-handed as possible with both sides. The challenge with that can be sometimes is that Confederate sources just aren't as numerous.
Right.
And, you end up leaning harder on the Union side to tell the story just because these sources exist.
Mm-hmm.
But on the Union side, too, when I think of what set the Army of the Cumberland apart, I think the key thing was command cohesion. Rosecrans was very much in his honeymoon phase with not just the rank and file, but also with the leadership of the Army. Now, the relationship with the leadership tended to degrade a bit over time, and there's some frictions that came up. But the command cohesion that he had at this point allowed the Federal Army to display a fair amount of flexibility at Stones River that was, I think, frankly, pretty impressive. I mean, their lines were folded back what amounted to 3 miles, and yet they held on and won the battle. So there's a lot to be said for their tenacity. Certainly, there was no shortage of courage on their parts either. There was not a lot of Union offensive maneuvers during this. They were largely on the defensive for most of the battle. Although there was Miller and Stanley's countercharge on January 2nd, which I think we talked about probably in the last episode.
I think we did, yeah.
So, yeah, as I said, I came away with a much, and really the way that this study was begun, I wanted to look at this battle from the ground up.
Yeah.
I really focus on what are the privates, corporals, sergeants, and the line officers. What was their view of this battle? So you come away with a different perspective. I look at the overall generalship at Stones River. I don't think there's anything here, with a few exceptions. There's nothing here that's like extraordinarily good, and I also don't think there's a lot here that's extraordinarily bad. But it comes to me the story of the men in the ranks. This is essentially, you can call this a drawn battle.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, both sides really pretty much fought themselves to a frazzle.
Yeah. And
it was decided by the narrowest of margins on January 2nd. It could have gone either way. And that seemed to be the case with these two armies whenever they got together, whenever they really clashed. You think of Perryville, you think of Stones River, you think of Chickamauga. I mean, when these two armies got together, it was a slaughter knocker. It was going to be brutal. It was going to be vicious. It was going to be bloody.
Yeah.
And that, like I said, it was incredible.
Yeah.
You just read account after account of what these guys did.
Yeah. So one thing also I want to talk about is, or just ask the question about, and this wasn't on our notes or anything, but there's a story that I've heard a few times, and I've heard it repeated a few times, and I can't for the life of me remember which Confederate regiment it was, but I've heard the story of a Confederate regiment that went into action close to the Round Forest without very many muskets. And
That would be the 44th Mississippi, under also known as Blythe's
so
regiment.
tell us a little bit about that. What's
Sure.
going on there?
So the 44th Mississippi, on December 26th, a couple of days, the campaign is just beginning. They're essentially under quarantine because I believe it was a smallpox outbreak. Weapons were a little short in the Army at that point, and they were part of Chalmers Brigade, which is pretty much Mississippians. And the decision was made that, well, you guys are under quarantine. You're not likely to go into action because you're dealing with this, rampant sickness within the regiment. We're going to take your serviceable arms and distribute them to the other regiments of the brigade that need them. And that's what happened. Well, a couple of days later, the decision was made, you know what? We're just going to keep your folks who have smallpox in the hospital. The rest of you are all going into action because we need the muskets. We need the men on the line.
Yeah.
And what they were issued was we'll call it the refuse muskets of the brigade. So, anything that might have had a bad mainspring, a bad rammer, maybe the barrel was slightly bent. I mean, you name it. I mean, but the arms were poor, to say the least. And the regimental commander certainly complained about it, but there wasn't much that could be done. You kind of wonder, well, what happened to those 20,000 muskets you all took up to Kentucky? They didn't go into the hands of any Kentucky. They weren't there. They weren't available. Chalmers Brigade is the first to make this assault on the Round Forest. The 44th Mississippi would have been on the right flank of that attack, very close to Stones River itself. They got within about a couple hundred yards, but they couldn't go any further. And honestly, they spent most of the rest of the day kind of hunkered down, trying to exchange fire with Hazen's brigade. I don't know how effectively, because most of their weapons were pretty shoddy.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the story that develops out as well, these men, they assaulted the Round Forest with nothing more, and really nothing better than sticks, which sounds a bit like an exaggeration, but given the condition of some of these weapons,
that's about all they were.
Really
anyway.
not.
Yeah.
If you can't burst a cap, you basically have a stick with a bayonet at the end of it. I mean, you got a pike.
Yeah.
And so, there's some, depending on one's point of view, there's some truth to that statement. As I said, they were not successful with taking the Round Forest. I mean, they charged up with Chalmers' attack. They took some hefty casualties. They went to ground. They stayed there the rest of the day, but they didn't advance another foot. They were done.
So we lost Daryl. He's having some internet issues, but he did want me to ask a question about one of those stories that has always been connected with the Battle of Stones River, and that is the Army bands serenading each other. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that story, how much truth is to it, and what's your take on it?
Okay, so let's break that down slow. So the events in question reputedly happened on the evening of Tuesday, December 30th, 1862.
Okay.
At this point, the armies were in very close proximity to one another. They were basically, it was the beginning of the battle. I mean, really on the right, McCook's right wing had moved into position that morning and afternoon. There was very active fighting in that sector of the field, skirmishing for the most part everywhere else. So, it was an active battlefield. The story goes that at sunset, and I don't know if depending on which account you read, one band or another in either army starts playing, like Yankee Doodle. And then it's, a Confederate band will play Dixie. And then the Union Army the Union band plays another. So they're kind of these competing songs, really. But you got to remember, music, this was a normal part of closing out the Army day. Most of these bands were, they're playing tunes for, really for entertainment. But there was also, bugle calls and drum calls and whatnot that, kind of directed the troops when to eat, when to go to sleep. And So there was music on this field as a part of the normal Army day in both armies already. The real story comes down to how these competing bands are really trying to outdo one another. The story is that at some point, one band starts playing "Home Sweet Home," which pretty much a neutral song, and the army and the bands of both armies join in, and they that's how the day ends, which is a very poetic. It's a beautiful story,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what one of the things Stones River is known for. The source of the story came from an article that Samuel C.A., who was a veteran of the 1st Tennessee Infantry, wrote in 1885 to Southern Bivouac. That's the first mention of it. I had, like I said, 4 banker's boxes here full of letters, diaries, newspaper articles, all contemporary to the battle, things that happened, were written very shortly after it. I have yet to find a single contemporary mention of this event in anyone's diary, anyone's letter.
You would think
And
that would be
certainly not in
something
the
that,
newspaper accounts. So,
yeah.
so part of me is like, did it happen? I don't think so, but I don't know that for certain.
Yeah.
And the reason being is there's lots of things that happen on the battlefield that nobody wrote about, or that we don't have the account.
Right.
For example, where were the Federal sinks? And I guarantee you they had them.
Yeah.
I don't know where they're at. Nobody wrote about them. They're there.
Yeah.
But I don't know where they're at. Same way, likewise with the Confederates. I mean, I don't know where those were. But as I said, that it is essentially now it's part of the literature of the battle. I do mention it in my book. I also mentioned my skepticism of it. But I would be delighted to see a period, and period meaning in 1863 or 1862, a period account that describes this event, because I've yet to find it. It's mentioned in some regimental histories. It's like CA's account, but these are things written, 10, 20, 30 years later. Right. And part of me, when I think about what makes the story so powerful, is that the message is one of unification.
That's an important thing to remember with this too, with when it comes out, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, because this idea that these men are sharing a common sentiment that they really just want to, they want to be home. They want to be home with their families. I don't doubt that was true at all.
Right.
The timing of it is such, by the 1880s, we're starting to get into this period of reconciliation between the Union and Confederate armies. And this can almost be viewed as in part a reconciliation story. And I wonder that's in part why it became such a powerful part of the memory of this battle. We have the memory of what happened, and then there's the memory of what we think happened. And I'll just give a short example. You and I are both old enough to remember September 11th very well.
Oh yeah, everything about it.
The night of September 11th, I wrote like a 5-page memoir of what I experienced that day, and I stuck it in an envelope, and I didn't open it for 15 years.
Yeah.
I was amazed how different what I wrote was from what I thought I remembered.
Right.
I mean, the night I wrote that, the night of September 11th, it was as fresh as it could be. And what I had constructed in my mind since, there were some significant changes there.
Oh yeah,
and I'm thinking, well, if that's the case with me, I got to think it's the same case with these guys that, they fight, and it's not like Stones River is the only battle these guys fight.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it possible you're conflating what happened at Chickamauga with Stones River, or what happened at Missionary Ridge or Perry? I mean,
yeah, and you just know that once your book comes out and somebody reads it, you're going to get an email. Well, my great grandfather had this diary where he was in the band and he wrote about what they did.
Hey, Ted, volume 2.
Yep. Yeah,
I would, but that's good, and that's, once again, I go back to my statement earlier about historians in our job. Our job is to move the football down the field.
Yeah.
And in the course of doing that, you're going to make a mistake somewhere. I guarantee it, because someone's going to have something you didn't have, you didn't know.
Yeah.
And if someone can say, "Oh, I've got a diary from my ancestor that was in the 42nd Illinois who describes it in great detail,
Yeah.
and it was written at the time of the battle," I'm like,
Yeah.
hallelujah. I would welcome it,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's probably the major, been called. I mean, I don't know if I'd term it a myth, a major part of the canon
Mm-hmm.
that has developed about Stones River ever since. And as I said, I think in the book, I'm sure the readers will get the impression I'm pretty skeptical, but I do repeat,
Mm-hmm.
it's just now it's just part of the narrative. It's
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
story.
And I think that's just so true about research anyway. It's the way certain events are portrayed by certain people that were there are very different compared to people who are right
Mhm.
next to them. And
Right.
I've discovered that in my own writing with Adam Rankin Johnson. And if anybody knows who he is, well, you'll find out about all who he is here if you read the book later
You'll
this
find
year.
out about here later
Found
this month,
yeah, a
right?
little tidbit there, but he is very well known for talking himself up. And
Mm-hmm.
when you read his memoir, it's almost like you're reading some sort of a Hollywood movie. I mean, just the things that he claims he does.
Yeah.
And there's one instance where Clarksville, Tennessee, he claims he busts into this college door, runs upstairs and finds Colonel Rodney Mason of the 71st Ohio in his underwear and just quivering with fear.
Oh my goodness.
But when you read,
Well, that's an easy target.
oh yeah, and so that's how he remembers that event. His second in command, who is
Wow.
right next to him, says in a Confederate veteran, written about the same time, I guess, several years after the war, and says, the white flag came out, or they heard cheers or something along the lines, and Johnson looked over at him and said, "They surrendered already?" So according to Robert Martin,
Has
Johnson
nothing to
wasn't
do with
even
finding
inside
somebody
that
in their
building.
underwear and
Yeah,
yeah.
so
Well,
it's
I said, and that's a ongoing challenge with any historian is really um, the veracity of the source.
exactly.
Yeah, and there's some sources that I mean, you come down. So for the Battle of Stones River, John Yerian, who I believe was an adjutant in an Indiana regiment, don't quote me which one, but he wrote a fairly extensive article for the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, and it's been generally quoted in previous books on the literature. I remember reading it, and he's talking about sitting in the command conference on the night of December 31st between Rosecrans. He provides a very vivid description of what was there. The problem was he wasn't there. and location's everything. And he had I've never seen any logical reason why the adjutant of a run-of-the-mill regiment would be at Army headquarters the night this was happening.
Yeah, in the middle of major.
So what I end up relying on for the account of that was Rosecrans' own words, McCook's and Thomas's, and David Stanley.
Mm-hmm.
I know they were there.
Yeah,
I know for sure they were there. I wish Thomas would have left. God, Thomas memoirs would be
wouldn't that be great for
we never got them. But yeah, I mean, but you run into things like that where people would give what appears to, on first glance, well, wow, this is really in depth, and then you find, well, yeah, but they weren't there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, where did this story come from? Did they hear it from someone who was there? Is it made up out of whole? I mean, it negates the value. To me, it negates the value of the account. Mm-hmm. So I didn't even quote from it.
Yeah.
I didn't think I quoted anything from it.
Yeah.
Because to me, I'm like, okay, he's an unreliable. Theodore O'Hara, another one.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking myths and stories of the battle. This supposed confrontation between Bragg and Breckinridge on the afternoon of January 2nd about this assault.
Mm-hmm.
Theodore O'Hara was not there.
Yeah.
But Theodore O'Hara was a close friend of Breckinridge.
Uh-huh.
So
he's going to get a version of that story.
This thing happened. Yeah. It's like, did he get this from Breckinridge?
Yeah.
Is this Breckinridge's version? Or knowing Theodore O'Hara's proclivities, was this something he manufactured out of whole cloth to shield his chief from criticism for an attack that went bad?
Yeah.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Because O'Hara is repeatedly a very problematic source. So, you end up going with the account. Well, I know Captain William Pickett of Hardee's staff was there, and he doesn't recall anything about there being any significant difference of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So, which one do you believe?
Exactly.
The O'Hara account is certainly I call it the sexier of the two, because the attack did fail. So people want to
Yeah.
that there was this controversy before it even started. Maybe that's comforting, or like I said, it certainly would shield Breckinridge from culpability or responsibility for what happened,
Mm-hmm.
and put it on Bragg, who is a widely disliked. Bragg's an easy straw man to beat up.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's not well liked.
Yeah.
So, but like you said, that's just part of our job as historians is try to sift that stuff out and try as hard as we are. I mean, we're getting a very incomplete picture, and as historians, we got to recognize that.
Right.
Even 25,000 pages of stuff on Stones River. There's going to be angles that are like, oh, I didn't know about that, because we just don't have the source.
Yeah.
So, and that's, like I said, history, it's an ongoing conversation. There's never a final answer. But as I said, we're trying to move the ball down the field towards it.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it too, I think. So, Dan, as we wrap up episode 3 here on Stones River, what's one thing you want to leave us with about this battle and campaign?
That's a hard question.
Sorry.
The common perception of Stones River was it was a bloody battle that decided nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember seeing a quote somewhere. There are a few battles that cost more and decided less. And I think that's a mischaracterization of what happened here. I would offer a counterpoint. What condition would the Union war effort be on December 5th, 1863, if we had been defeated at Fredericksburg, defeated at Chickasaw Bayou, and defeated at Stones River with the Emancipation Proclamation just issued? What impact would that have had on recognition from France and England? I think we talked about in episode 1, one of Lincoln's major worries at this point was that Parliament was about to go into session, and the issue of recognition of the Confederacy was certainly on their radar. And he did not want to give them any reason whatsoever to lean towards recognition, because I think he felt it would have been decisive.
Mm-hmm.
Had Stones River been a defeat instead of a victory, a narrowest of victories, but a victory nonetheless, the subsequent course of the Civil War could have been markedly different. Lincoln himself, writing, 9 months after the battle, he kind of shudders to think what condition affairs would have been in had they lost.
Mm-hmm.
And is thanking Rosecrans again for, pulling through and securing that victory. So it was crucial from its timing. Now, granted, it didn't recover a ton of territory. I mean, the Federal Army ended up taking about, they moved their front lines about 30 miles south. The other impact of the battle, it just exacerbated the command tensions that already existed within the Army of Tennessee and just made them worse.
Mm-hmm.
So one could offer that there was that ancillary effect of degrading the effectiveness of the enemy's army. It was certainly thousands of men were put out of combat through it. But as I said, I think to me the real significance of Stones River is it was an extraordinarily bloody battle, and it's a fascinating study. But its value is in its timing, mm-hmm. and the what if it had not. What if Rosecrans had been defeated here? I'm not quite sure how we're looking after that.
Yeah.
I don't know that the war. I'm not going to offer that the war would have ended. Mm-hmm. It certainly would not have. But I think the way it would have developed in the coming year would have been very different from what has come down to us in history.
You're right.
And the possibility of English or French intervention. Like I said, the possibilities are endless, but to me, that's,
Well, all right.
So it's not meaningless carnage.
Oh yeah. And I don't think any battle really is. I think it's they all have some sort of impact, no matter how big or how small. There is always going to be an impact there that decided something that happened later. So,
Yeah.
Dan, on behalf of Daryl, since his internet cut him out, I do want to thank you so much for talking with us about Stones River for 3 episodes now, and I still think there is so much more we can talk about with Stones River.
Oh, we probably got 3 more in us,
Oh, for
but
sure. So we'll definitely do this again, and I mean, I would love to have you on to talk about things like Hartsville and just about the Army of the Cumberland or just about the Army of Tennessee, and just pick your brain on that stuff. So,
I would be delighted. This is fun. I enjoy
yeah,
it.
it's been a blast. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you again.